It is April 1st, 2010. We are at 3003 Pikes Peak Road, Elbert County, and my job is to tell Steve Batty on videotape what my family did at Grand Lake and what we started with and how we started. Now, we probably started with Grand Lake probably sometime during the 1880s, even though my family physically did not live there until the 1920s. Photograph taken in 1940 by a man named Spradley, and then later colorized by him, hung in our house at 845 Milwaukee, Denver, Colorado, for most of the time I was there, from 1958 up until 1983. The little picture here happened to be taken by my grandmother, Shelby Paxton Thomas, probably sometime during the late 1920s. It is also Grand Lake. Now go back to the big one. This is Grand Lake as I remember it, and it was also probably taken from about the spot where the county commissioners were shot in 1883. The ice house probably stood about right there where the man was sleeping when the commissioners were shot. What was known as the Rustic Hotel was probably just a few steps away from where the photographer was. This map from Ghosts of the Shooting, 1961, by Nell Pauley, shows that area. And this was the road to town, and then this was about where the commissioners were shot. The partner of my great-grandfather was Senator Thomas Patterson, who had a law office with him from about 1875 up until about 1883, 1885, somewhere in there. My great-grandfather, Charles Thomas, was probably acquainted with Grand Lake, not only through Senator Patterson, but also through his partner, who happened to be W.H. Bryant, later on, when my great-grandfather was governor. So I'm fairly sure that my great-grandfather had probably seen Grand Lake at least a couple of times, and I'm fairly sure that my grandfather, Hubert Fletcher Thomas, had at least a couple of weekends, if not 2-week sojourns at the Patterson house and probably at the Bryant house. One of the things that has always struck me over here is the fact that part of Denver was Grand Lake. This, for instance, is two views of the Hannington house, this one taken in 1912, and this is the same porch taken in 1948. This is Lucy Thomas, this is Shelby Paxton Thomas, my grandmother, and this is Hubert Fletcher Thomas, my grandfather. They are all taken at the same place, and they happen to have been friends of the Hanningtons and of the Wards. Now, one of the things that I did not get a copy of or a picture of was the greenhouse at Grand Lake, where my family rented space from about 1923 up until about 1949. The greenhouse at Grand Lake is the second oldest building on Grand Lake that is a residence. And let's see, there is the Adams House on Adams Point, which was built by the predecessor to my great-grandfather in, I believe it was built in the 1880s. And then shortly thereafter, sometime around 1881, the greenhouse was built. It was built by a man by the name of John Barbie. John Barbie's daughter, Mabel Barbie Lee, was a professor at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. Mary Lyons Cairns, in the book, The Old Days, talks about not being able to find any record of John Barbie whatsoever. However, I don't think Mary Lyons Cairns had ever read Cripple Creek Days, a little bit of which is dedicated to what John Barbie did for the Wolverine Mine in Teller City when he was superintendent there. These are a few relics from our time at Grand Lake, all of them from the Brown house that we used to live in on the west side of the lake. We left there in, I believe it was 1978 or shortly thereafter. This is an iron which is usable on a stove and actually has been used from a wood stove for pressing clothes. It's number 5 iron. We used to use it as a doorstop. This is a genuine doorstop, which probably was purchased around the turn of the century, and it has been since repainted by my wife. And this kettle, which has been used, always sat empty on top of the window at the brown house looking out toward the lake. Now, in order to understand how my family operated at Grand Lake, there was a series of incidents which began with my grandparents' marriage in 1917. My grandfather happened to be a partner in a New York bank, and as such, he had a very prosperous life until the bank went bankrupt in 1923. My father, please cast down here, my father, Charles Spaulding Thomas, who was born in 1918, was followed by Lucy Paxton Thomas, his sister, born in 1920, and Hubert Fletcher Thomas, who was born in 1923. That is their mother, Shelby Paxton Thomas. When my grandfather went bankrupt, his only option was really to come back to Denver, Colorado, and start over. The terms of the bankruptcy were such that he was liable for funds that were deposited with the bank in New York, and unfortunately he spent most of the rest of his life paying those back. He was, however, able to find backing in Denver and began what was called the Western Securities Company, which was a mortgage banking outfit, and the way that he made a living was to offer loans to farmers hard hit during the 1920s and the 1930s in places such as Granby and Parshall and Yampa. What he would do once a month is go to a local cafe, and he would sit and have cups of coffee with ranchers and farmers, have them sign notes for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so on, and then he would loan them the money. And what would happen, every one of them, according to my dad, would be paid back with interest and on time. However, these were loans that were considered a little bit riskier than what most of the banks would do, especially during the 1930s. Now, the camera is going back down to some pictures taken from the time that my grandparents and parents first arrived at Grand Lake, about 1923. This is a picture of a couple of sailboats. This, of course, is a picture taken during the 20s or 30s of Grand Lake. It looks like it's in the snow. And then another picture, probably of one of the Hofstadt races from the late 20s or early 30s. And then this, I believe, is the Dorothy, which my father owned. He had bought it from Dorothy Bryant for, I believe, $99, and sailed it faithfully every regatta during the 1930s. This was a photograph of trees that we had found in the scrapbook, and it is not really labeled. My grandparents were friends of Nellie Hart. Nellie Hart, who married Bob Hannington in approximately 1912. Nellie Hart's father, Dean Reverend H. Martin Hart, happened to be the Dean of St. John's Cathedral in Denver. My grandmother, who was a churchgoer, probably was a very good friend of Nellie Hart's, and Nellie Hart being an only daughter of her father, and the hostess for her father, probably longed to go someplace quiet. It was a 2-day journey from Denver to Grand Lake during those days, and so I imagine she and her father took the entire month of July or August to go to Grand Lake. They lived in the greenhouse. What happened during the time the greenhouse was empty? I believe that was when the Thomases rented it. I believe they rented it for $100 a month, and I believe also they were allowed to keep their boats there, and so they became more and more members of the Grand Lake Yacht Club, and probably more and more of a presence from 1923 on at Grand Lake than their landlord, Nellie Hart. Nellie Hart Hannington continually had the greenhouse up until 1950, and she used to decorate the walls of the greenhouse not only with cushions in order to insulate it, but then on top of the cushions she would paste the Rohug Reviewer pictures from the Sunday London Illustrated Times, and there were pictures, as I remember growing up, of what royalty looked like pre-World War I. These were all taken down by owners from the early 1970s. Okay, cut. Ed McCrillis, who happened to know my father pretty well from the late 1920s on and attributed my father with saving his life, managed to write an early life and adventures, privately published, about his time in Grand Lake, Colorado. This is a copy of his book, in which he talks about his early time, not only at Grand Lake, but also with my father. This is one of his photographs of my father when my father was 18 years old, so 1936. Turn on. My grandparents, as I said, had lived in the greenhouse from 1923 up until 1950 as renters. There was also a small brown house that happened to be adjacent to it on the same property. A little bit to the south of us, I believe, happened to be the Wilkins-Effinger house. Down below was the Henry Hannington, later General Orlando Ward house, and we basically had the hillside. There were some things that happened after World War II when my dad, who happened to be a second lieutenant in the Army, came back after having done some interrogation for what were known as the Brandenburg trials in Austria, which were closely tied to the Nuremberg trials. He was discharged in 1947, and he and my mother happened to spend the spring that they had together in the company of Mrs. Henry Roan, who also fed them, in the town of Grand Lake. My mother fell in love with Grand Lake at that point. My dad resumed his study of law at the DU Law School in the summer of 1947. When my father was out of law school in 1949 and a successful attorney, one of the things that he wanted very much to do, especially upon the birth of his son Charles, who was an older brother who I never knew, was to purchase a boat that would happen to be his own. Unfortunately, the cost was a little bit too much, and so he and Uncle Fletch and Aunt Lucy each agreed to pay for a third of it, and a third of the trailer, and a third of the registration, and a third of all the stuff that goes with the sailboat, and buy an e-scow from Johnson Brothers in Michigan. What they did was they found a good used e-scow, and my mother and father and my brother Charles, who was only about a year old at the time, went to Michigan to get the Shelby. These are pictures of what they were doing. Here's a picture of the Shelby, probably taken right out of the Johnson Boat Works, and on its trailer. Note the trailer happens to have been a former touring car, probably from the 30s. Still has running boards and so on. We used to play on that when I was a little boy. Now down here is a picture of what it looked like in color. I don't know where they're parked. And then these photographs are the Shelby as it was on its trip. Because they're stiff, it's a little hard to turn the pages. They were towed by, as far as I can tell, a 1949 Dodge. Okay, this is a picture of the Shelby being launched at Grand Lake. You note the Harrington's boathouse there. The Carey's boathouse now is what it's called. Built by Clyde Eslick during World War II. And you note behind my father, there's the Shelby. I do not know who that man is. I presume that it is Clark Blickensderfer, his brother-in-law. And here's the Shelby in the Shelby trailer being slowly pulled under the beach and off the beach into the water. There are other, better color pictures that were taken of the Shelby being launched. And then bring it on up here. Another picture. I believe this is my brother Charles. I believe this is Uncle Fletch. I believe this is Aunt Lucy. Here's my father. And this is Mark Wagner Thomas, who is Fletch's eldest. And then here is Charles, and here's my father. So we got all that. Okay, now let's go back. This is a photograph that was handed me by my cousin David Paxton Thomas, when my brother died. It was the morning of my brother's death, and he'd gotten this from a scrapbook that his mother, Marjorie Wagner Thomas, had kept. And he took the photograph out and he put it in the frame and had it matted and was taking it to the Hospice of St. John. He arrived approximately an hour after my brother had died. This is Uncle Fletch at the tiller of the Shelby. There's my father. This is, I don't know who all. There's Uncle Fletch. I believe this is my mother. I believe that is Marge. And I believe that's my father. But I cannot tell for certain. And then that one there. My brother Charles, unfortunately, died in an accident at the age of 4. He fell down a cistern in Oklahoma in 1953 and was drowned instantly. Unfortunately, I think that even though my parents continued to sail, I think that it made them sort of put a curse onto the boat. The Shelby was an E-scow, and the Shelby was one of the few E-scows on Grand Lake up until 1969. There were only 5 of them, and in order to win the Lipton Cup, you had to have at least 5 large boats. The E-scows, the Shelby always had an M33 on it, were the mainstay of the fleet, and so there was only 5 chances for skippers to win the Lipton Cup from the E-scow. My father captained the Shelby all the way up until 1968, when the mast broke and pulled its footings right out of the deck, which rendered it useless as a sailboat. Also, the Shelby was possibly the winner of the Lipton Cup 1951, 1952, and 1953 because of its lightness and also because of my father's skippering. Each time he lost by only 1 race. In 1953, evidently one of the booms or a mast fell and almost cut off Clark Blickensderfer's arm. And Clark Blickensderfer, being a practical man, decided that he would fiberglass the Shelby. He built his garage at 9 Parkway Drive, Inglewood, Colorado, an extra 20 feet in order to accommodate the Shelby so that he could spend an entire winter fiberglassing it. This made the Shelby much, much heavier, also much, much steadier. It had a blue hull, and it had a frame that was just too heavy, and consequently it was always the last in the race. During Regatta Week, I can remember the buoy that was closest to our house, when it was rounded by the Shelby, usually about an hour after all the other boats had rounded it, including the Lightnings and the Whistlers. The Shelby would go round and we would all shout hooray, which I believe my father and whoever was crewing for him could hear, and they'd all wave and get back into the race, even though the race had been done for an awfully long time. My father, who served as both secretary and treasurer of the Grand Lake Yacht Club, is seen standing here during the Commodore's ball. Scally O'Donnell at the microphone, Studdard White over here. I do not know who the gentleman is standing there, because he was part of the board of directors, and as secretary and treasurer, he was facing in 1964, 65, 66, and 67 a real crisis at the yacht club, in that there was no money coming in, and the families that were there could not support the yacht club. And so what my father did was he persuaded the other directors to allow people who did not own yachts or property on the lake to become members of the Grand Lake Yacht Club. Among them happened to be the Howard Frys, of which I believe Howard Fry III became Commodore, the Studdard Whites, who at the time did not own property, and also the Clarence Bloomquists, who later on distinguished themselves in the roles of the Grand Lake Yacht Club. He also made it so that people who were only part-time summerers and did not own yachts became members of the yacht club. This included the David Abbotts, the Dudley Abbotts, as well as the Murrow Brewers and the Gordon Sumners. Okay. This is Fletcher Thomas at the bottom of a cesspool, which was used up until about 1980 from both the greenhouse and the brown house. The reason I'm showing it is because this picture, taken about 1951, 52, maybe even 53, happens to have been the mark of when my grandparents bought the hillside from Miss Hart Hannington for $10,000. My grandmother then had printed up a bunch of stationery from the Kendrick Bellamy Company that said Pine Knoll, the Thomases, Box 13, Grand Lake, Colorado. That stationery has long since disappeared. She also had a sign put up that said Pine Knoll. It was on steel. It was white with red lettering. And they also had a signpost put up at the junction of the roads near where the Spider House is to point for the Thomases. And it just said the Thomases. That sign is no longer there. However, the post is there. And I was amused to see the post with all the name signs on it, accepting the Thomases, at a gift shop in Grand Lake a couple of years ago. Okay. These are more pictures of the cesspool. My father, Fletch, and Clark had to dig through a great deal of rock in order to create this thing. Here's my brother Charles in the cesspool. Obviously, it is not being used. It is not being used at this time either. The cesspool had been dug basically for use in perpetuity. However, it was used specifically by Richard Blair after a number of years when, at the Brown House, we got our own cesspool. Okay. Now, life at Grand Lake fell into a very easy rhythm for me. There were always cousins around. The agreement was that the Blickensderfers, that would be Lucy, Clark, Tom, and Jim and Tom, would share the greenhouse with my mother and father, Charles and Mary Jo Thomas, and me, and then later my brother Shelby. Okay, cut. Beach scene. From the beach, you can see the road here, and then that, and then a fence marking the Carey's Field here. However, this was a typical beach scene from the 60s at Grand Lake, and what we were doing, my mother, who is pictured over, there's Aunt Lucy, there's my mother. My mother and Aunt Lucy would have a six-pack of Lucky Lager between them, which they would start devouring at about 10 o'clock. By about noon, we'd be tired of the beach, and so we'd go up the hill to our houses to eat. And then our mothers would be taking naps from about 2 until 4 in the afternoon, while my cousin Tom, who's 6 months younger than I would usually find something to do. We'd be climbing Scout Rock, or we would go to abandoned or deserted houses. We would explore. We would climb trees. We would do any number of things. During that time, I remember Grand Lake is incredibly hospitable in that we could go over to Mrs. Everest's house, or we could go to just about any place and find ourselves welcome. One of the earliest memories that I have is of going over to the George Castler residence and sitting and being entertained by both Mr. Castler and Mrs. Castler. However, just about any house was open to us during that time. Okay, cut. However, because of the close proximity, and also because my father, his brother, and his sister all wanted their privacy, the Blickensderfers found it much, much better to go and build their own house. And on the side of the hillside, Clark designed this huge house for Lucy, the biggest house at the time, where the boys would have attic space upstairs. Most of the living would be done on the top floor, and then the bedrooms would all be downstairs. Each one of these bedrooms has its own exit outside of it because Clark insisted that anybody who got up early would probably not want to tromp through the rest of the house in order to get his coffee. And the idea was to go outside, down this walkway, and then up the stairs and go in and make the coffee. Unfortunately, if you've ever been in there, you'll note that it is not insulated, and so therefore anybody walking along any part of the house can be heard from any other part of the house. One of the things that was interesting about this boy-proof home was the fact that in 1961-62, when it was being built, Tom and I spent a great deal of time climbing all over it as it was a skeleton and enjoying getting in the way of Clyde Eslick and his workmen. Clyde Eslick, pioneer of Grand Lake, had been loaned money when other people had refused it to him, to the tune of $10,000, I believe, in order to start his construction business or to expand it, which he paid back to my grandfather in about 1955. It was all done. My grandparents by this time had been dead. Lucy Paxton Thomas in 1958. Hubert Fletcher Thomas, he died in 1955. And so this picture, which I still remember because I am the third little boy running down this step, was taken in 1961. And I remember that the photographer, who is standing about where my finger is out on the road, was really harassed because we had to take the picture about 5 different times. Wearing raincoats running down a staircase for 5-year-olds is a really interesting situation. The house here has not changed a great deal. There's still the red counter. There are no longer these swivel chairs which used to scream on their bearings. But the refrigerator is in about the same place, different model now, and the windows are still about the same. Over here in the living room, windows and furnishings are approximately the same. The stove is definitely the same, but it's got a nice deep patina on it. In the picture are Aunt Lucy and Uncle Clark. Going to these other pictures, these hung on our walls for years at Grand Lake. Now, I had always thought that the gentleman in front was my father. However, because it was 1962 and he was not running for office that year, he decided that he would give the honor to Scally O'Donnell, who is who was the Commodore at the Grand Lake Yacht Club probably 2 years later. Next to him is his brother-in-law, Jack O'Ryan, I believe, and I believe this is Dudley Abbott. They are on the E5, known as the Suzanne, which was later acquired by my Uncle Fletch. Now, a lot of the photographers for the contemporary section of the Denver Post used to come up to Grand Lake, and they did photo shots, not only because they'd be fed, but because they would be entertained. And so there are a lot of things, like, I don't know if this camera will get the captions, but there were a lot of set shots where people who didn't sail at all, like Rodney Davis, was shown putting up rigging, and a number of other people are helping each other on with life jackets who have not been near the water at all. Now, this final one is a picture of me, which was taken, I believe, in 1967. It was part of the contemporary section, and what happened was I was there with my little model sailboat, the Jenkins, which was made by Charles Jenkins, who had been a longtime fleet chaplain of the Grand Lake Yacht Club. He was a client and a friend of my father's, and so I got the Jenkins. I never won the model yacht race with it, and really, at the end of 1968, it was pretty well all over as far as our time at Grand Lake. In 1968, even though I thought, because I was going to go into the 6th grade, that Grand Lake would last forever, and that from about June 10th until Labor Day, we would be going to Grand Lake every summer, and it would be carefree, it was not so for my parents. A lot of people talk about the current recession as a pretty dangerous one. There are a lot of mild ones in between. In 1968, unfortunately, there was a recession, and my father suffered a great number of investment losses. Couple that with a couple of heart attacks through which he was uninsured and through which he had to have some major surgeries, and there wasn't a great deal of money left. His law practice suffered, and so therefore we were not going to be going to Grand Lake for the summer of 1969, 1970, and 1971, during which my father took a number of paid jobs, and some of them were very lucrative and others of them weren't. My parents thought that they would rent the place at Grand Lake. It would be the Brown House in 1969, and unfortunately they were pretty bad landlords. They rented to people who were too demanding or people who kept on talking about cut rates, and my parents usually succumbed to that. Consequently, total income from the property at Grand Lake each of those years probably just took care of the taxes, and that was about it, although I suspect that my parents lost money. Finally, what happened in the summer of 1971, the summer of 1971, was that Mrs. Akeholt of Humphreys, who had just lost her mother, had Matilda Humphrey Bunty, was saddled with the job of taking over the store that her mother had left on Grand Avenue, the Humphreys Gifts. And she was in need of having a boy to do errands and the stock work and so on. And I had applied, and so she asked if my mother was, if indeed I were my mother's son. My mother, who was very charming, was able to assure her yes, I was, and that was my first summer job at the age of 14. What I did in 1971 was I worked for Leonard P. Zick principally, and I was sworn at by him. The first mayor of Grand Lake happened to chew a cigar. He lit it at the very beginning of the day and then started chewing the thing, the receipt of which usually went into a wastebasket behind the counter where he worked. So Leonard P. Zick was always famous for putting down the numbers in the cash register, and then he would turn and land it in the wastebasket. My job 3 times a day was to dump Leonard P. Zick's wastebasket in the commodious dumpster that was out behind Humphreys. Mrs. Akeholt, who had never run anything before except junior league plays, was sort of overwhelmed by the fact that she had all these adolescents and pre-adolescents to basically run in running a store. Humphreys was filled with college girls doing all the service, and they got $50 a week. I too got $50 a week for 6 hours a day's work. I got, I believe it was Wednesdays off. And so what I would do is I'd report faithfully, I would mop the floors, I would wax the floors, I would leave at approximately 5 o'clock, I would get there at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning. It was not the most pleasant of jobs. And consequently, it was not, Mr. Zick was not the most pleasant of bosses. And also, having been one of the summer people, I really sort of resented the fact that the only reason that my family was up at Grand Lake was because I had a job at Humphreys that demanded 6 hours a day, or six days a week, I'm sorry. And so what I would do is I would work. My mother and my brother Shelby would stay at home. My brother Shelby did some socializing and wrote and also ran around. The boating was principally the canoe, or the Shelby, which, as I'd said earlier, had lost its mast, was turned into a motorboat. And a lot of people had thought that it was just ghastly that we would put a motor at the back of a 28-foot e-scow and drive it around. However, that was probably about the only seaworthiness that the Shelby really could exhibit at that point. Many people did not know that. After 1974, I was no longer interested in working at Grand Lake. I really had lost any of the feeling I'd had for it, and social life at Grand Lake struck me as a big nothing, because most of the people there, especially during the party scene of adolescence and also of posing and so on, was not very interesting to me. Now, granted, I was not necessarily the easiest teenager to get along with, but it always struck me as stupid that nobody at Grand Lake seemed to be able to read. Many people seemed to be able to get drunk, and that was really about it. I also, during the time that I was there, between junior and senior years of high school, during my last year there, I was really struck by the fact that a number of people my age were getting jobs courtesy of the merchants at Grand Lake, but the jobs that they got were merely spending money and usually done at the person's own time and behest and desire. At the Boot Hill Golf Course, for instance, at the very end of town, my cousin Jeff Thomas was employed there. However, the Boot Hill Golf Course, which proudly proclaimed that it was going to open at 10 o'clock every morning, sometimes was opened by Jeff at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sometimes was not opened by Jeff, sometimes, depending on just how sick he was, it was not opened at all. A lot of that I resented. I resented the fact that I happened to be a townie. I resented the fact that I had to work to stay there. And so I told my parents that basically if they wanted to sell the place, that I wouldn't stand in the way. My brother Shelby, however, had a different impression of Grand Lake. One, he liked the place. He loved the place. In 1978, when my father wanted to sell it for $68,000, my brother stepped in and tried to figure out some way that he could work to make it still go. My father was pretty adamant. Richard Blair, who lived next door, who had bought the greenhouse in 1970 from my Uncle Fletch, had wanted to buy the brown house for years. And Richard Blair was ready to make a killing and just buy the brown house and then use our front yard as his parking lot, as he had been doing ever since 1970. And so therefore, our time at Grand Lake pretty well ended in 1981 when the papers were signed shortly after my father died. The property is now owned by Tim Harrington, whom I remember when he was growing up. His father Martin and my father were friends. My father actually dubbed Tim's father Smokey the Bear, not only because of his squat ursine appearance, but also because of the big Smokey the Bear hat that he used to wear. And so my time at Grand Lake is now spent maybe about 2-3 days per summer at the Blickensderfer house for a load of firewood, where my children and I sit and read. Sometimes we go canoeing in Tom Blickensderfer's canoe, and there are other times we build a fire. And sometimes I take them to Daven Haven. I also take them to various restaurants around there that I remember, and I show them haunts that Tom and I had frequented. There are not very many people I've known from those days or kept in touch with. Joanne Abbott, we used to keep in touch with Margie Wilkins Effinger, however she died a couple of years ago, and with Dorothy O'Ryan. There are very few other people with whom I really was close, nor very many people with whom I really want to deal. My Uncle Fletch, upon his death, relinquished his property at Grand Lake, and the proceeds went to his children, Mark, Dave, and Jeff. So there really aren't any Thomases left on Grand Lake, just my cousin Tom Blickensderfer and Jim Blickensderfer, who live in the boy-proof home still. I'd like to show you my last photograph here of the Thomas family, taken in 1992, shortly at the Hospice of St. John, shortly before the death of my brother Shelby, who was born in 1961. This is cousin Dave Thomas, Fletch's second, who was born, I believe, in 1952. His wife Pam. My brother Shelby Thomas, born in 1961, died in 1992. Wait a second. Okay, yes, this is Tom. This is Tom Blickensderfer, state senator, born 6 months after I was. So in June 21st, 1957. This is Jeff's son, Robert Thomas, who was born, I believe, in 1984. This is Jeff Thomas, who was born in 1956. This is Jeff's son, Trent, who I believe was born, Graham, who I believe was born in 1985. Here I am, William Corbin Thomas. This is Millie Mitchell Thomas, Jeff's wife, now ex-wife. This is her son, Trent, born in 1991. I am holding my son, Ian Thomas, born in 1991 also. This is my wife, Joanne McLean. This is yes. This is Jim Blickensderfer's wife, Claudia Weitzman Blickensderfer, holding her daughter Sarah, who was also born in 1991. This is James Clark Blickensderfer III, son of Clark Blickensderfer, who died, I believe, in 1986.